Now, on Good Friday, I shared with some of the folks who gathered for our Good Friday service a story that I hadn't thought about in a long, long time. It's a story called The Rag Man. And I was thinking about it on Good Friday because it's a story about a person who gives his life. But it's also an Easter story because it's a story of a man who's raised up and continues to transform lives. You see, the rag man came into a city not too different than our own. A city that was struggling. A city that had fallen on some hard economic times. A city that had kind of lost a lot of hope that it needed to keep going. As a city, it was hurting. And the individuals in the city were hurting too. They had the kind of aches and pains and the sadness and sorrow and regrets that we all experience from time to time in our lives. And so not much was happening in that city. And then one day, the rag man came walking through the city streets, shouting out to all the people, "New rags for old! New rags for old!" People were kind of curious. What does he mean, new rags for old? Didn't make sense. But the man kept walking, "New rags for old! New rags for old!" And he came upon a woman who was sitting on her steps of her home. And she was surrounded by toys, the toys of a child, the baby luggage and the carriage and other toys. But this woman had lost her child. And in that loss, her husband couldn't take the pain, and they'd lost their marriage. And sitting on the steps, she was sobbing into a handkerchief, uncontrollable sobs, weeping, tears of sorrow, sadness, regret. And the ragman came to her and said, "New rags for old, new rags for old." She didn't know what he meant, but he handed out to her this beautiful white silk cloth. He said, "New rag for old." And he took her tears in that rag, handed her the new silken cloth, and he took her rag and he put it in his face and he began to sob. He began to weep his own tears, and she was puzzled by this, but she noticed that as he did, he sobbed into her old rag and she held this new beautiful silken cloth, a kind of peace washed over her. A great sense of contentment that even though her child was lost to her, her child was not lost to God. That her child was being cared for and loved by God. And she clung tightly to that cloth and found a great sense of peace in her life. And the man walked on, shouting through the streets, "New rags for old! New rags for old!" And he came upon a homeless man sitting on the side of the street who'd been wiping the dirt of the street off his hands, trying to get the smell of the city streets off of his body. His rag had become filthy. He'd wiped away the dirt that one gets when you have to rummage trash for your food, when you have to continually hold your hand out like a beggar that you are to receive grace from strangers. His rag was filthy from wiping the smell of the city streets off him, but the rag man came to him too and said, "New rag for old?" The homeless man handed him the filthy rag, and the rag man handed him this beautiful, clean, white linen cloth. And the homeless man felt it, and there was no dirt on it now. It was clean, it was pure. He felt like the dirt within inside of himself had been washed away. He felt like a man again. He felt whole. The rag man took the dirty cloth upon himself, and then he put the cloth in his pocket along with the other rags. And off he went, new rags for old, new rags for old, gathering up the filthy cloths of all those in that city who were living as broken people, making them whole once again with these new rags. Well, people by this time were extremely curious what this was all about. And so they began following him through the city streets, witnessing these kind of miracles as he took the old rags from people and gave them new rags. And then one Friday they followed him all the way outside of the city, to the other side of the town, to the garbage dump at the edge of the city. And the rag man took all those filthy rags out of his pockets, out of his backpack, and he laid all those filthy rags down in the dump. And the man laid down on the rags. He went to sleep, and then he died there in the dump. And people walked away with a great sadness that they didn't have the rag man anymore. Some walked away with great confusion. They didn't know what that was about, but they regretted not getting their dirty rag to him in time before he had died. But then 3 days later, Sunday morning, as people were waking up in their beds, as the sun was rising and a bright, new, glorious day was beginning to shine down on that city, they heard a familiar voice echoing through the streets. New rags for old. New rags for old. His Spirit was still with them, still coming to them, giving them a chance to live, giving them a chance to take their old rags and exchange them for new. Folks, isn't that what we're doing here today? This stranger, Jesus Christ, came into our world 2,000 years ago to take our old rags into death and offer us the new rags, the new clean rags of life. Isn't that the voice we hear echoing through our city streets, maybe even ringing in our hearts today? New rags for old. New rags for old. Folks, Jesus died and Jesus was raised. The Apostle Paul says, as we die with Christ, so too we are raised to new life with Jesus Christ. Today, we bring our old rags to Jesus Christ, and He offers us the new rags of life. Praise be to God. Amen.